Meanwhile, air travel is fast recovering from the hit that it took during the COVID-19 pandemic, and nearly about 4,000 flights took off every single hour. Now, India alone has seen a tremendous growth in its aviation sector. It is estimated that this year the number of flyers might touch a staggering 100 million. Now, economically, this calls for celebrations. But what about its environmental impact? We decode that in our next report.
Shifting to sustainable aviation fuels is often talked about. But what about the emissions from airports? In its fight against climate change, India is gearing up to make its airports carbon neutral in the next 2 years. Indian Aviation Ministry is presently monitoring carbon emissions from 30 airports. These actually represent the majority of air traffic in India. And between 2020 and 2021, carbon emissions at these airports was around 0.3 million tons. This was at the time of COVID pandemic when flights were very, very thin. What does this mean, and why is this of concern? While airports too emit harmful greenhouse gases which impact the climate. If you're wondering how, let me explain. Airports use ground fuel for cars, fossil fuel for electricity and heating, and jet fuel for auxiliary power units. Well, India has taken cognizance of this and has pledged to make 26 of its airports carbon neutral by 2024. 5 of these in Delhi, Mumbai, Hyderabad, Kochi and Bengaluru have already begun the work. So within 2 years, 21 more airports will join the list.
Today we have already in India, out of the 141 airports, heliports and waterdromes, 131 are airports alone. Out of those 131, we have already about 5 airports that are pretty much carbon neutral. You would say between level 3 and level 4 plus. And those airports are Hyderabad, Mumbai, Delhi, Cochin, and Bangalore. Another 6 airports in the next 2 years will become close to carbon neutral. Our plan is to ensure that we have carbon neutrality as far as Airports Authority of India is concerned on close to 26 airports by 2024. And mind you, 15 airports alone in India contribute 80% of India's total emissions out of this basket of 131. And so therefore carbon neutrality to us really means that you are carbon net zero in terms of emissions. And so therefore the focus is on renewable energy, the focus is on RPOs through the grid, the focus is on, as I mentioned, solar power and being carbon neutral.
It is commendable for India to take a step like this, especially at a time when Western nations are walking the opposite direction of their climate pledges. Interestingly, Indian airports emit far less carbon than others. Is this in absolute terms? Should it not be correlated to the number of flights and passenger load? Well, according to a global study of 2021, New Delhi Airport recorded the least carbon emissions of 5.53 million tons annually, which is 1/3 of London's Heathrow Airport, and less than half of the emissions at New York's John F. Kennedy Airport. South Korea's Incheon Airport and the Frankfurt and Hong Kong airports produce over 10 million tons of carbon dioxide per annum.
Civil aviation is only 2% of total emissions internationally. Fortunately, it's a high-profile industry, but it's also unfortunate that it's a high-profile industry, because with the bouquets, you also get the brickbats. But we are only 2% of global emissions. And even if you look at within the transportation sector, civil aviation contributes only about 11.6% of the total emissions within transportation.
According to the International Civil Aviation Ministry, 10 million people around the world fly per day. Goods worth $18 billion are transported every day, and with globalization at play, experts say air traffic will rise by 4.3% per year over the next 20 years.
The impact of carbon emissions on our world have been a major source of concern. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions can restrict the impact of climate change. In the fight against climate change, India and several other countries are taking conscious steps to bring down these emissions in the aviation sector. India's aviation ministry is also carrying out carbon mapping of all its airport assets to make airports carbon neutral in India. With video journalist Neeraj Patel, this is Aditi Gupta for WION World is One.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.